Good morning and welcome to the Point. Well, clearly this week, presidential politics focused on Michigan. On Wednesday, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump was in Flint and got a bit of a rebuke from a pastor when she thought his remarks were a little too political. The trip began with more than a little confusion. The normal advisory that would be forwarded to media never arrived, so we were left to figure out the details on our own, follow the large contingent of police, and look for a big airplane that says Trump. Not exactly super sleuth stuff. Some of his supporters figured it out too. From the airport to the water plant, and this time some protesters greeted Trump as he toured the facility, to a local church where, when his speech became too political for his host, the pastor reined him in.
Hillary Clinton supported NAFTA, supported China's entry into the World Trade Center. And by the way, NAFTA is probably the worst trade deal ever made in the history of our country, probably in the history of the world. In the history of the world, signed by Bill Clinton, allowed China to run up a $1 trillion in cumulative deficits and trade deficits with the United States. I mean, China now, if you look at what is going on, a trade deficit of $500 billion. Hillary failed on the economy, just like she's failed on foreign policy. Everything she touched didn't work out, nothing. Now Hillary Clinton.
Mr. Trump, I invited you here to thank us for what we've done at Flint,
Okay.
not
Okay.
to give a political speech.
Okay, that's good. Then I'm going to go back onto Flint. Okay.
Then back to the airport, and the trip, with no media and no public component, was over. In about 2 hours, one of the more unusual campaign stops of Decision 2016 was over. Tim Kaine was in Ann Arbor on Tuesday. He was talking to students at the University of Michigan. He was also talking to us about what was going on in the campaign, and at that time, we were unclear as to when Hillary Clinton would be back on the trail. She has since returned to campaigning, but that's where we began our conversation. What have you heard from her, directly from her, and when do you expect her back on the campaign trail?
It will be soon, but she's going to follow her doctor's advice about getting back on, and that's what she should do. And she and I talked very quickly after the incident Sunday, and she was in good humor and good spirits, and I think that she did what a lot of people do when they find out they're a little bit sick, which is, I think I can power through it, and that's Hillary's way. She's got a real strong work ethic.
What does that do for you and your campaign? Does it put more pressure? I know you got a lot of surrogates out there, but obviously we're inside 2 months. This is a busy time for a campaign.
It's impossible to be busier than we are. So, we have a very, very aggressive schedule. But look, I think, it raises questions, especially kind of the difference between what we know about Hillary and what we know about Donald Trump. Hillary has produced a lot of information about her health. She's produced her tax returns. Donald Trump really hasn't produced health information of any significance and hasn't produced tax records. So I think it kind of raises the question right here as everybody's paying attention, do we know these candidates? I think people know Hillary Clinton. I think there's a lot still to know about Donald Trump.
I want to shift gears and talk about your visit to the University of Michigan, because one of the plans that your campaign is talking about is being able to provide free tuition for a lot of families in the state of Michigan, people under $125,000. That's a big group of people. How do you...
89% of Michigan families would benefit from this free tuition proposal that Hillary and I have, and we also have a guarantee. We think we ought to make college debt free for everybody. Michigan's a good example. The state funding to education has been dramatically reduced over the last decade, and that means that consequently, the cost to families have grown up dramatically, and now in Michigan, there's nearly $40 billion of student loan debt. And then that makes it harder for students to graduate and start careers, buy houses, buy cars. It hurts the economy. So we have a significant plan. It's bold, but other nations can do it, and we can too.
I've got 2 boys that are looking at college in the not-so-distant future, and I'm interested in that, but like many taxpayers, I'm also interested in how you'd pay for that.
Yeah, and at HillaryClinton.com, we lay out exactly how we're going to pay for it. Here's how we're going to do it. No family that makes less than $250,000, we're not going to increase taxes on families at that level. And we actually will provide many with tax relief, like, for example, through a child care tax credit, et cetera. But there has been growth in the economy. Sadly, the growth has has sort of accumulated at the top end, wealthiest companies, financial institutions, and individuals. And we do think that taxes need to go up there so that we can reinvest the money in education and growing jobs. And if we do that, everybody will be better off, including those who will pay a little bit more, but it will be for the good of the country.
Obviously, you're here at the university, but we have a heavy manufacturing base here, and over the past decade and a half saw some very struggling times like all of the country did. But one of the things that people in Michigan are wary of are trade deals. They feel like NAFTA and others have been bad for our business here, and we know that there are trade deals pending. Where are you on some of those trade ideas and how they would impact Michigan manufacturing?
So trade is a reality, but we should only do trade deals if they meet three basic criteria. Do they increase jobs? Do they increase wages? Do they advance America's national security? I voted about a year ago to give President Obama the same tool that other presidents have had to negotiate the best deal possible in the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Pacific Rim nations and bring it back to us. They negotiated a deal, they brought it back, and it doesn't meet my standard. The labor and environmental protections especially are not standards that in my view can be enforced. And the details themselves are good, but only if you can enforce them. So in this instance, the TPP deal, which may come up for a vote sometime, it's just not something that I can support. And then I'll say this, we in Virginia do manufacturing too, and one of the key manufacturing elements to the Michigan economy is the auto industry, and President Obama, with the support of Hillary and me, did a lot to make sure that our auto industry was strong. Donald Trump and Mike Pence on the other side were against the steps that President Obama took to save the American auto industry, and that would have been a huge difference in Michigan and so many other states.
Going to international policy, we know that going forward, whoever the next president, vice president are going to have to deal seriously with the Middle East and the problems with refugees, terrorism, and all that goes along with it. What is your view on bringing more people from Syria and elsewhere here to places like Michigan?
I have basically said, as long as the vetting procedures are very, very tight, which they are, we shouldn't be afraid of refugees. The U.S. has had a real track record of being a humanitarian nation. And so I have made sure that I've done my homework to make sure that our vetting procedures are strong. When we started to hear concerns about refugees in Congress, what we did is we looked at it, we concluded that our vetting procedures were what they needed to be, but we actually did discover that some of the tourist visas needed some tightening up, and so we've done that. But look, as long as we have the appropriate security procedures, we shouldn't change our fundamental posture of being a humanitarian nation. The Syrian crisis is one that is probably the greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Other nations are responding, and the U.S. should respond appropriately as well.
What should we do in that region, either militarily or diplomatically, to try to play our role in trying to bring some kind of stability there?
Well, let's talk about ISIS, and then we'll talk about Syria. So in ISIS, it's a two-step strategy. The first is we have to continue to support efforts on the ground. And these are efforts on the ground that while the U.S. is helping train and equip, primarily it's the Iraqi military, the Kurdish Peshmerga, their fighting force, and the Syrian opposition. We're supporting them, and those efforts are squeezing ISIS down. They've lost a lot of ground since the pinnacle in August of 2014. The problem is what ISIS does as they lose ground is they decide, well, we should try to do attacks elsewhere, maybe in the Sinai or maybe in Istanbul, maybe in Paris, or even trying to find a lone wolf in the United States. The only way you stop that is by having really strong alliances where you can share intel with a neighbor. Here's somebody we're worried about who's come into our country, who's trying to travel to your country, and if you can share that information, and that's what we're doing, we can stop or really reduce the threat of terrorist attack. That's why, one of the reasons I'm so proud to be Hillary's running mate, she's a diplomat and understands the need to build alliances. Donald Trump is talking about getting out of NATO and shredding some of the alliances we have. And if you do that, then you don't share intelligence. And if you don't share intelligence, then you become more vulnerable.
Not to be overlooked, presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, Gary Johnson, was in the state this week talking about his vision for the country and about that auto bailout.
They made horrible choices. They should have been rewarded with those by making those horrible choices by having gone bankrupt. We do have a mechanism for restructuring, and it is bankruptcy. I don't think that Michigan, the auto industry, would have died at all, but I think that government interjecting itself in business does, in fact, pick winners and losers.
So why all of the attention on Michigan? Well, our pollsters at Epic MRA told us this past week that the race here is getting tighter. 38% of the people surveyed say they prefer Hillary Clinton, while 35% say Donald Trump, and that is statistically a tie. 10% like the Libertarian, Gary Johnson, and 4% say they would vote for the Green Party's Jill Stein. 13% say they still don't know. Up next, we'll talk with two Grand Valley State professors about the state of this election and what it means going forward. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. No question, this is an unusual election cycle. We sat down with two Grand Valley State University professors to talk about that, Professor Erica King and Don Zenman. We started with the Trump impact.
I think that one of the things Donald Trump represents is a new way of audience participation in the media. And one of the things he's been able to do, I think excellently, is resonate with a large segment of the American audience and learn how to speak to that segment of the audience, and of course at the moment is trying to expand that audience. But by his presentation of self, I think it's not just being with the media as it's changing, but also representing a lot of the sentiments of the American public. And I think he very early on cathected onto a sense of grievance, of anxiety and frustration across an even larger segment of the American public, which got people not necessarily instantly on his side, but willing to listen to him.
You made a very interesting comment when we were sitting downstairs before we came up, that no matter what happens in this election, unless something remarkable happens with a third-party candidate, we will elect the next president of the United States, and they will start out with a 60% disapproval rating, because even though, as you point out, Mr. Trump has spoken to a broad section of the society, has also alienated a lot of them, and Hillary Clinton has done the same thing, not just during the cycle, but maybe over her 30 years in the public eye. What does that say about the electorate and our mood?
Well, what I think will happen, I'm quite convinced now that this is a very divisive, polarizing, bitter, and at times scary and dystopian election. But I do believe that whatever man or woman is inaugurated on January 20th, he or she will have low approval ratings, which will probably, barring a major rally around the flag crisis of sort, low approval ratings, which will probably bedevil the next president for their entire presidency. I think there's going to be a lot of hard feelings and bitterness and anger and resentment and conspiracy theories that percolate from whatever side loses the election, that will last throughout the next presidency. I do not believe the next president will enjoy any kind of a early presidential honeymoon with the American public that we've seen from other presidents. Barack Obama, for example, his opening approval rating with Gallup was 68% when he started office. I don't see that happening with the new president. And I also think that whichever party loses the presidential election this year will win very substantially in the midterm elections in 2018. So what we could be talking about is, legislatively speaking, that is, getting your legislation through Congress, that legislatively speaking, that you're really talking about a 2-year presidency, a very narrow window for the next president to actually push their bills through Congress.
What does this do to campaigning overall? Because this has broken the mold. We are used to seeing candidates be presidential, or at least to some degree. When there is a big attack to be made, that's made by a surrogate. Largely, not always, but that has largely been left, a lot of times, the vice presidential candidates, but even others. Even in this case, certainly with Donald Trump, but Secretary Clinton talking about a basket full of deplorables just a few days ago coming out of the candidate's mouth. Have we gotten to a point now where the candidates themselves become the voice of the attack?
It certainly appears that way, and I expect it to become even more so over the remaining weeks of the campaign. What's interesting is we've had campaigns in the past where the candidates have tried on occasion, for example 1964, to separate themselves very, very much on the issues, and the whole notion from 64 of a choice, not an echo, but have refrained from vitriolic personal attacks. And this year I think we're seeing a choice, not an echo, accompanied also by very, very personal attacks. Is this due specifically to Donald Trump? I think perhaps he has made it more of a personal attack fest than would have been otherwise, but I still think there would have been a lot of personality involved. And I think perhaps again, it's our changing media scene of 24/7 instantaneous coverage. Things reverberate then around the internet, social media gets involved, and the public, which at this point is already seeming predisposed to polarize, become even more polarized, and you see it in the discourse of the candidates.
I mean, it's not the compliment you want, but I can remember 4 years ago when I was talking with now Speaker Ryan, and we were talking about President Obama, and he said, look, President Obama is not a bad man, he's a bad president. So not exactly complimentary, but he wasn't attacking him personally, but that's changed this year. I mean, is Trump easier to attack because he's attacked everyone?
Well, certainly, I don't think Trump elicits a lot of sympathy. That is to say that if the Clinton camp, and I'm not saying Hillary herself, but if the Clinton camp were to vitriolically attack him on a personal level, he's not the kind of person who would elicit a whole lot of sympathy. If anything, I mean, we've seen this. He's very thin-skinned. He can dish it out. He can't take it at all. And I'll tell you what, thin-skinned, intolerant of criticism, bad temper, these are not traits you want in a president. These are not traits you want in a president. Vengeful, vindictive towards his perceived enemies, gets upset at every little perceived slight. These are very, very dangerous character traits to have in a president. The most modern examples that come to mind are Richard Nixon and LBJ, both of whom self-destructed in office.
You wanted that.
I agree with some of what you said, but I also put a somewhat different emphasis on it as well, and that we have some evidence from campaigns, Michael Dukakis being one in 1988, where candidates were attacked and then chose to rise above the fray and not respond. And so what I'm also seeing this year is candidates and their advisors taking that message and saying, if anybody either attacks the Republican or the Democratic nominee, respond with all guns blazing, because otherwise they get the media message of negativity toward you and you don't get your response out.
The Clinton people have been very good at that rapid response ever since the 1992 campaign. That's something that the Clintons have always been very good at, is responding quickly.
You made a pretty big indictment of what you perceive as some of the shortcomings for Donald Trump in terms of becoming president. At the same time, there would be those from the Trump camp that would say, well, wait a minute. For the past 30 years, every time that there is an issue with Hillary Clinton, it's always been somebody else's problem. There's never anything to see here. That would be their perspective. Do you see any problems with her leadership style?
The Clintons have become very protective of themselves, perhaps out of response to their critics, which fuels a sort of negative feedback loop that they have something to hide. And that I do think they've, on some matters, become more prone to secrecy than I think a lot of citizens are comfortable with. And for Hillary Clinton, and well, for her husband as well, there is a tendency to speak in tones that are very lawyerly and very careful in how they choose their words, that makes a lot of people distrustful of what they're saying. So in contrast, you have Donald Trump, who doesn't think before he speaks at all and just says whatever is on his mind, and oftentimes the things that he says are just horrible or completely false and inaccurate. And the Clintons, who can be overly cautious in their discourse and how they speak, and a lot of people can find that slippery. How
does this play? I mean, obviously, we go back to the very same point we were in. Does it really matter? who you as a viewer like or dislike, the next president of the United States is going to have a very high unfavorable margin. And what, if anything, can you do to overcome that?
This is, of course, the $64,000 question for both of these candidates, because you're absolutely right. Poll after poll shows both are extremely unpopular across a wide range of voters. People, for example, whom you might think would be Hillary supporters in large number, younger people, younger liberals, younger progressives who went so ardently for Bernie Sanders. And one of the arguments that I think Bernie Sanders had going for him was how impassioned he was about the issues he cared about. And I think Donald Trump is somebody who also has a very good understanding of the media, recognizes the power of that kind of personal connection and passion. And I don't think anybody would argue that Donald Trump isn't passionate. But that's one of the arguments being used against Hillary Clinton, is that she's very, not just legalistic, but sort of very clinical in her approach. And for somebody who represents a nation, a way of life, a vision of what this country ought to be, passion is something that can appeal also to a large segment of the American public.
So that's the unvarnished politics of it, but what does it mean for government going forward? When you think about the terms of the way we have kept our government funded over the past number of years, when there have been continuing threats of government shutdown, one's looming even as we speak, when you talk about just that thing, that the vast majority of people just don't think that Congress specifically and government in general does its job, this election, my words not yours, would appear to do nothing to change that perception, no matter what the outcome is. So what is the longer game? And you're professors, you're not soothsayers, so I get that. But what do we have to do, maybe starting with your students or with parents like me talking to my kids about somehow readjusting and reinstalling some faith in government, understanding that government's going to have to do something for us to have faith in? Where do we go?
This is a very tricky question, because one of the things that I think we've noticed in the last 20 plus years is that with our primary system, which has come under a lot of scrutiny now, what tends to happen is that the small number of people who actually turn out to vote tend to be either at the very liberal end of the Democratic Party or the very conservative end of the Republican Party. And so they are often tending to support candidates then who run on the issues of polarization and not cooperating, and that can get them reelected. So you're right, is this a long-term process? I just don't see much hope in the short run.
We're a representative democracy, and the government is really just a reflection of us. So the people that we're electing to represent us are a reflection of us. So I can't blame the politicians 100% here. I do think there is an ethos that you see on the right and on the left that says compromise is bad, compromise is spinelessness, compromise is weakness, compromise is capitulation.
Bob Dole's presidential candidate was over before it started because he used the word compromise.
And until we get out of that ethos, and I think the media feeds into it a lot too. The media has a way of being obsessed with calling, winners and losers, and always trying to measure who's ahead and who's behind, and who's winning the argument, and who's on the offensive and who's on the defensive. The media is playing into this environment and encouraging it as well. And this notion that somehow a compromise represents a capitulation or a sellout, and we don't just hear this from the Trump supporters. We've heard this from the Bernie Sanders supporters as well. In fact, that's why a lot of Sanders supporters don't like establishment Democrats, is because they compromise too much.
They give up too much.
They gave away the store on Obamacare, and they should have fought for single payer.
My thanks to all of our guests. We'll be right back with more To the Point. It has been an active week of politics, particularly on the presidential level here in Michigan, and for that matter, all over the country. And with less than 2 months to go before the election, it's only going to get busier. That's why we'll be here every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock to bring you the latest of what's happening in our state and what's going on with the race as a whole. I hope you'll make it a point to join us. To the Point.